Hello, everyone. It's Armando Lacerda here, and thanks for attending our application development virtual group from PAS, from Professional Association of SQL Server. Our virtual group, we meet when we get good presenters like we have today, and we are working on a schedule. We have a next one coming in a couple weeks. But today it's all about self-service data prep in Power BI with Matthew Roche, sorry.
It's all
So
good.
before, all good. So before we get started with Matthew, I would like to apologize. I couldn't find my presentation, my introduction slides here. So I'm gonna go with the what I have in my head. First of all, don't forget we have the PAS Summit coming in November, right after Halloween, and we do have a discount code for you. I will probably show this discount code at the end of this presentation when I'll probably be able to find my introduction slides that I'll be showing at the end, more likely. But yeah, keep connected to the group. We're gonna post the code there as well. We have had a few presentations in the past on SSIS and some other technologies that are relevant to developers. So please don't forget to check out our YouTube page, as well as connect with our Twitter handle and our LinkedIn page. You just search for app dev, application development with PAS. One last thing, we have many virtual groups and we have local groups. Make sure you create you already have your account with PAS to look for your local groups to get connected. We cannot survive in today's technologies landscape without being part of a community and learn the new things from each other, right? So with no further ado, I'm gonna give the microphone to Matthew Roche. I have met Matthew Roche personally in many conferences, mostly in Seattle area, but some other places too. And I was telling Carnegie, our co-organizer here in this group, that everywhere, anytime I get to know that Matthew is presenting, I'll be there. I know it's going to be relevant.
Boy, no pressure.
Matthew, the microphone is yours.
All right, well, thank you very much for that that humbling introduction. Let me just say hello to everyone. So my name is Matthew Roche. I'm a program manager on the Power BI team at Microsoft. I've been with Microsoft for almost 10 years, so my 10-year anniversary is coming up in early October. And over those 10 years, I've worked on SQL Server integration services, master data services, data quality services. I was on Power BI during the first iteration or first version of Power BI, then went to work on the Azure Data Platform, primarily on Azure Data Catalog, and I joined the Power BI Customer Advisory Team, sort of a customer focus group inside the Power BI engineering org back in March of this year. So most of my career, both at Microsoft and for the 15 years or so before I joined Microsoft, has been really around data and application development. I started off in the 90s doing VB5, VB6, Windows NT, networking and similar configuration, fell into the SQL Server world in version 6.0 and 6.5, and really fell in love with the data platform. So there's lots of parts of the architecture, parts of the platform where people can specialize, and I know that not everyone has a chance to specialize, but I found the place that worked for me and have sort of grown here. And what I hope to do today is to introduce the new capabilities that are coming in Power BI this fall, so that either as a business intelligence professional, a data platform or database professional, or as an application developer, you are ready to take advantage of these capabilities when they're available. Everything that I'm showing today is currently in private preview. So if you jump in, it's like, oh, this looks really cool, I want to go play with that. You won't see the options that I see when you look in Power BI yourself, unless your organization is one of the low triple-digit number of organizations that has been participating in our private preview over the past few months. These capabilities will be coming in public preview this fall. I'm not going to give a specific date, but it's coming sooner rather than later. And if you are listening to this in a recording rather than seeing it live, you may well have these capabilities already. The one other thing that I want to mention is that if you have questions during the webcast, feel free to put them into the chat window. I have that open on another monitor, so I may see them and respond. If you have any questions after the session, my Twitter handle is on the slide, and I had posted. Let me pull this guy down. So I had posted about 20 minutes ago, sort of the "oh, we're almost ready to go" post. If you have questions that don't get answered during the talk, just either tweet them at me or add them as a reply to this tweet, and I will get to as many of them as possible as quickly as possible. So with no further ado, let's actually jump in and let's jump back maybe, I don't know, 20 or 25 years or so. So when I was first getting into the data world or working with data in a professional manner, for the most part, the components that made up a data infrastructure or a data system revolved around having a small number of transactional systems. So these OLTP line of business systems, where each one of them was typically shipped as part of an application. So one for payroll, one for HR, one for CRM, one for issue tracking, or whatever it is. So every system had a database, and people would build using Crystal reports or VB or Excel. They would build reports or dashboard-like reports on top of those OLTP databases, and this was great. It was good to have insights that the application itself didn't provide. A lot of applications were built on top of SQL Server or similar database platforms, which essentially enabled this standard development against the relational model. This reusable data that you could work with in many ways. But there were also lots of challenges as well. A lot of these challenges involved the difficulty in having data from multiple line of business systems included in a single report, because even though each one of these databases probably had a customer table or a set of tables that included customer data, every data model was different. They had different keys, they had different IDs, they had different schemas. One of them might have 10 columns, one of them might have 100 columns, and half of them are optional. It was difficult to get a consistent view of a single business entity from multiple systems. This is really where the data warehouse pattern was introduced. So the data warehouse was created and designed as a solution to a set of common problems that were introduced by the need to have insight and business intelligence on top of multiple source systems. And of course, to get the information into the data warehouse, there needed to be some set of extract, transformation, and loading logic. So that ETL pipeline or ETL platform, which we can also think of as data preparation. So we'll get it into the right shape, we'll make sure that it's consistent, we'll fix known errors, we will flag new or unknown errors, we'll get the data as consistently and cleanly as possible into the data warehouse, so we can then do our reporting and our dashboarding on top of it. But of course, as this became more and more successful and more users wanted to run more and more reports with more and more data more and more frequently, the complicated thing is that the relational platform that most data warehouses were built on wasn't really meant to scale for all of these different workloads. So this is why, and this is, 20 years ago that SQL Server OLAP services was introduced. So we had the analytic models or in-memory models that were designed for this super high-speed interactive slicing and dicing of data, different technology, different patterns, all there to allow more users to get more insight and make better business decisions on their data. And around the same time, I shouldn't say around the same time, around the same place in the architecture as the data warehouse, in the last decade, we've also had the concept of big data or data lakes being introduced. And even though hopefully everybody on the call recognizes this, I'm kind of waving my hand saying that these are the same thing. A data warehouse is obviously not a data lake, but if you look at the end-to-end architecture, they often fall into the same tier or play a similar role in this end-to-end flow, where the data warehouse and data lake are each of these interim repositories for data so that it can be used for purposes other than the purpose for which it was originally created or originally produced by that source system. And some of those purposes can involve business intelligence as well. Very often the difference between a data lake and a data warehouse is both technological as well as the scenarios that businesses are thinking of using them for. So we won't get into the big differences there, but basically this is what a lot of modern data platforms look like today. And one of the challenges that all of this technology introduces is, how do the data people, or to phrase that in a slightly different way, how do the data teams inside the IT organization keep up with all of the demands of the business? Because business people are becoming more and more technically savvy. They want more data more frequently, and they want a faster turnaround. They need to be more responsive. They get competitive advantage from it. And it's our responsibility as technologists to give them the data that they need. But of course, at the same time, most businesses don't have an infinite budget for data engineers or data modelers or report developers. So this is where self-service capabilities tend to come in. Self-service business intelligence tools like Power BI, and there's lots of others out there as well, but what they have historically emphasized is having the ability to do some sort of self-service modeling. So I will mash up data from multiple places, and then I will build my own reports and my own dashboards on top of it, and then I can share those with other users. And of course, the differences or the details, there will be differences in the details based on the technology, but this is often where those self-service capabilities are emphasized. And if you look at Power Query in Power BI or some of the other data preparation capabilities in other tools, very often there are self-service ETL or self-service data preparation capabilities that are in these modern BI platforms, but today, most of them skip the data warehouse tier. If you think about Power BI today, the ETL work that you do in Power BI Desktop using the Power Query editor as part of that data modeling experience, all of the mashing up and the reshaping and the cleaning and the standardizing of data that you do is going against some sort of source system. That source system may be an IT managed data warehouse or data lake, or it may be one of these OLTP systems. But anytime that we are skipping that data warehouse, we're reintroducing the problems that the data warehouse solved 25 years ago. So we have inconsistency, we have unpredictable refresh schedules, it's difficult to manage concurrency and load and all these other things because our Power Queries are defining the tables in our analytics model rather than the tables in the data warehouse. So this is kind of going to bring us to some of the challenges in modern BI today. And I swear there's a demo coming up before too long. I just looked at the clock and said, oh my goodness, it's 12:15 already. So looking at challenges in modern BI, very often one of the biggest challenges is there's more data in more places and it's difficult to have a consistent view of what's what and what's where. And it's not simply the volume of data, it's also the variety of data. So we still have SQL Server and Oracle and all the big relational platforms on-prem. We've got data warehouses in the cloud. We've got big data on-prem and in the cloud. And we've got all of these different SaaS services. So odds are everyone on the call is using Dynamics 365 or Salesforce or some similar cloud-based application system to manage business processes that they would historically have had to install software on their desktops for, and each one of these cloud services manages and exposes its data in a different and often aggravating way, making it difficult to have a consolidated view of what's going on. Typically, data technologies require a high degree of technical acumen and specialization. Having that end-to-end business intelligence solution will typically require, someone using Informatica or integration services or Azure Data Factory, or one of these difficult, expensive tools, these big, heavy-duty ETL tools, to load the data into the data lake or data warehouse. And then there's a different set of tools for analysts doing self-service reporting and a different set of tools for pro reporting. We have a very fragmented marketplace today. The fact that every application has its own unique way of representing and modeling common business concepts. This was a problem 30 years ago, remains a problem today. Every system tracks customer, but no system tracks customer in the same way. And getting all of these things to work together, because even as the tools like Power BI evolve, the landscape and its complexity continues to evolve and become more difficult and more complicated at the same time. We're really fighting an uphill battle here. So if we look at how Power BI and most BI platforms today exist, we can think of them in three different ways or three different layers. We've got a set of connectors, and for Power BI, we have gateways as well to enable communication with on-prem data sources from cloud services or cloud-based clients. So we've got a connectivity stack. We have a modeling stack. So this involves in Power BI the analysis services tabular engine, which is integrated into both the service and the desktop tool. And there's a variety of ways that you can build and deploy and manage those models. And then we have visualization, which includes things like reports and dashboards and mobile application, as well as the Q&A natural language feature that allows users to simply ask questions of their data without needing to actually build something or procedurally build something. And in Power BI, we are announcing, so this is finally getting to the point of what we're talking about today, we're announcing a capability that we're calling data flows in Power BI, which is a capability for self-service data preparation that integrates with Azure Data Lake Store Gen 2, so our current generation data lake in the Azure cloud, allowing Power BI users, and I want to pause here for a second. When we think of Power BI users, the personas of people who work with Power BI on a daily basis, there's a very wide spectrum. There are some people who are technical professionals. If they weren't working in Power BI, they'd be working in reporting services or integration services or SQL Server Management Studio, but Power BI is a productive tool for them to solve a lot of problems. There are analysts. So these are people where very often they've never taken a class on working with data. They may not know the difference between a table and a view and a stored procedure, but the analysts live at the intersection of the data itself and the business processes that the data supports. They may not be experts on data, but they are absolutely the experts on their data. And then the analysts are often the people that are producing the reports and the dashboards for self-service, and they can then share those with data consumers, with people who may not be comfortable enough to build a pivot table in Excel or a report in Power BI, but they can use and read those reports. So what we're looking at with these self-service data prep capabilities inside Power BI is targeting all of those personas for different use cases. So we have no-code scenarios, we have low-code scenarios, and we have what I like to call, but the marketing team hates it when I say this, we have the mo-code scenarios. So, or they like to say pro-code, but I came up with mine first. The capabilities that we're talking about are integrated into Power BI. It's not a new service. It's not something that you need to buy. If you are a Power BI customer, you will get these capabilities as soon as they are available. we have that same set of connectors for both cloud and on-premises data sources. So as you'll see as I get into the demo, we're actually going to be using Power Query in the cloud or Power Query in the browser, so a very familiar experience in a new place. Data flows include integration with the Microsoft Common Data Model, or CDM. We'll pause here for a second as well. If you've worked with Microsoft Dynamics or the Power Apps platform for self-service application development, you've used the Common Data Model and the Common Data Service behind it. So the Common Data Service is this highly productive transactional data platform that's part of Dynamics and the Power Platform, so Power Apps and Flow. And the Common Data Model is a set of standard entity definition. So this is an account, this is a promotion, this is a customer, this is a product, this is a sale that are used across Dynamics. And in the recent past, I want to say it was earlier this year, but it may have been earlier than that, Microsoft said, it's great that we have a common data model, but for this to really be valuable, we need more contributions, or we need more perspectives reflected. So we have released the common data model as open source on GitHub, and not only are we allowing contributions from multiple parties, we're actively working with industry standards groups to get existing standard schemas for industries like healthcare and manufacturing and other represented in here. So we'll see some of this as we go on. We're designed, or we're focused on enabling more capabilities for data reuse. This is honestly why I was stressing the whole data warehouse, data lake tier in that initial intro, because what this self-service data prep capability will allow users to do is to load data into a logical data warehouse inside Power BI so that it can then be reused in more ways. We have logic that won't need to be duplicated in multiple data sets, for example, because it can load data once into these data flow entities that are backed by the Azure Data Lake Store. And because this capability is built on and integrated with Azure Data Lake Store Gen 2, we have the power of that platform to do in-lake transformations on the data and to work with it in ways that wouldn't be possible otherwise. So we call all of this data flows. You may have heard other names used for this capability earlier on. I won't name any of them, but we call them data flows as we go. So what I would like to do now is to switch from the slides and actually walk into a demo. And I see, I'm gonna glance over at my other monitor here. I do not see any questions coming in, so that is just fine. So I have, I've shared a browser, so I've dragged my browser over onto the screen. I do want to point out, I am using our DXT, or our dev test environment here. I already have mentioned a few times, these capabilities are in private preview. Microsoft and other organizations involved in that preview do have these capabilities in their main prod environment. As a member of the product team, this is where I do most of my work, so this is where I tend to do most of my demos from. The capabilities that are in our DXT environment will typically be in our production environment in a week or two, depending on how that release train is going. But I'm looking at a workspace, and inside the workspace, and this is just standard Power BI workspace, we've got dashboards and reports and data sets. The thing that's new is this capability for data flows. And I'm going to create a new data flow. We'll walk through right from the beginning and go through from an end-to-end perspective. So the first thing that I want to do when I'm creating a data flow is I want to create an entity or a set of entities. Similar to how when you are creating a database, you build tables. If you're creating a data model on Power BI Desktop, you'll create queries that load into the tables. The terminology here is data flow is the container, and that container includes all of the logic, all of the prep logic and the query code that will be used to load the data into the entities. The entities, if you think about them as tables, you're spot on. So conceptually, they are tables with columns that are have names and data types, but the actual physical implementation under the hood is that each entity is part of a folder structure in Azure Data Lake Store with one or more CSV files containing the data. So we've got this standard CSV format where we're persisting it, and we have a JSON file that is describing what data is in what files, how it's partitioned, and so on and so forth. So I stress this, or I plant this as a seed so I can come back to it later. So I'm going to come in here for my whatchamacallit, my first entity that I'm going to create. I'm going to connect to the data source that says Common Data Service for Apps. I've already signed in using my organizational account, so all I need to do is put in the URL to my Dynamics instance. And I do want to stress as well, if you look up at the top here, we are in the Power Query editor in the PowerBI.com browser experience. So if you're familiar with Power Query and Power BI Desktop, you'll see a lot of similarities between what you work with every day and what we see here. You can connect to CDS for apps in Power Query. You know, this is not new functionality from a desktop perspective, but what I see when I connect to the Common Data Service is I have the ability to expand out this common data model. So this has all of those standard entities or standard schema entities that are being used by all of the Dynamics applications or Dynamics 365 applications and Power Apps inside my organization. Looks like things are running a little slowly today, but as I expand this out, we're going to get back, you know, I want to say 300 or 400 different entities, so it's not super huge. What I'm going to do is I'm going to choose the account entity because I know that this one has data in it in my demo environment, and it's alphabetically near the top of the list. So I can see, just as I could in Power Query, a set of columns and rows for the preview. When I choose next, here I have, again, that Power Query editor experience that we're used to seeing. It's slightly different, and one of the things that I will point out here is that if I, let me rephrase that, when I'm using this, I will almost always try to right-click and look for options in the context menu that aren't here yet in the browser. We do not yet have 100% parity between the transformations in the browser UI and the desktop UI. So you know, put a pin in that idea, and we'll come back to that in a second. I do want to stress, however, that the advanced editor is available. Anything that you can do in a Power Query query, you can do here as well. Very, very few exceptions. I shouldn't say any because there are a few differences depending or based on limitations in the data sources that are supported, but again, we're moving towards full parity for them. The big difference that we have here is once I'm done with my transformations, and because I'm starting with a CDM entity, I don't actually want to transform anything. What I want to do is I want to say I'm going to map this query to a standard CDM entity. And when I choose map to standard, I get a drop-down list of entity types that I can map it to, again, coming from that common data model. And just as you would expect to see in any ETL, any ETL tool or process, like a destination component in SQL Server Integration Services data flows, here I can choose for the columns that are in my data flow or that are in my query, I can choose these source columns, which is basically the bottom shape of the query that I've just built, and I can then choose what columns I map to the column definitions that are in this standard entity. Because I'm going from the CDM account to CDM account, I don't need to do any custom mapping here. We'll auto map as well as we can, and here it's sort of the easy happy path scenario. But when I map this to the entity type, the metadata that's stored in Power BI, including in that JSON file in the data lake, will identify this as a CDM account, and this will allow, similar to a data-centric interface, if we think about interfaces from a programmatic perspective, any client component that knows how to deal with a CDM account will know how to deal with this CDM account because of the metadata that we're providing here. So this is sort of the simplest path through. I created a new data flow, I added an entity to it, I selected my Dynamics or Common Data Service instance, I picked an entity, I loaded it through. Could have done more than one. I did one for this simple path. The next thing that I want to do is I want to come in here and add an entity that's a little bit more complex. You never want to see me do anything complicated in real time in demos, because I am that guy that always types things wrong. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to paste in the path to a text file data source. It is in Azure, so we don't need a gateway, and I've set up the account so that it is anonymous, so I don't need to provide any credentials because it's just demo data. So as I come in here, I will see another query in my editor. I will see the preview just like I would working with a text file in Power BI Desktop, and I'll notice that, like every other text file in the world, there are standard things that we need to do to say things like use the first row as headers. If we notice this guy, we've got this promotion description. If I transform this, we want to split it by delimiter. We'll choose a custom delimiter, we'll use a hyphen, so we can go through and make the transformations to split out because we had multiple values in the row. We could do data type transformations and so on. I will simply give this guy a name, and notice I'm not going to map this to standard. This is, even though it is a promotion and there is a promotion entity in that common data model, this is not a CDM entity. It's the, whatever source system was producing this entity. I just want to use it for that same analysis. So I give the query a name, I choose done, and now my data flow has two different entities defined in it, one of which is this CDM entity. So notice that entity type is account. We know exactly what it is. This one is named promotion, but the type is custom because who knows what it is, right? So the next thing that I want to do is I want to load in information from a public data source. So this is something where if I'm looking to see how well accounts and promotions are the effectiveness of my promotions, it's very common, and it's becoming increasingly common to include publicly available data about events, about climate, about news, things along those lines. And one of the best sources for data is the World Bank. So if we look at climate change data, so if we want to see, for example, if we want to build an ML model or other predictive intelligence to look to see how factors related to climate change may be affecting aspects of our business that we're monitoring in our own systems, having a data source like this would be very useful. And I have done tons of demos using this data set in its Excel format. So if you, let me see, we'll see if my zoom works here. Yeah, so if I zoom in, you'll notice that the World Bank has an api.worldbank.org site. So it's basically their data API for all of these data sets. But notice this guy, it's download format equals Excel. Or for this, download format equals CSV. They're literally just giving you a file with the data in it as part of the HTTP response. It's not like a REST API or OData or anything along those lines. And if I were working in Power BI Desktop, I would simply point to this XLS file and work with it. But notice it's XLS, not XLSX, which means that in order to actually process and have an unattended refresh, I need to have a gateway set up, because the old school ACE engine, the Excel data engine, was never designed for unattended execution. So this is, this is true of any part of Power BI or any cloud execution environment. You need a special way to deal with the old Excel files. So what I want to do instead is I want to work with the CSV files, because CSV is standard format, right? But when I click on this, notice what comes back. It's actually a zip file that contains a set of CSV files. And this complicates things a little bit because there is no native way for Power BI to unzip a zip file, right? There is no zip file connector, a zip file data source. However, the zip file is a pretty standard format, and Ken, one of our awesome Power BI community members, blogged a couple years ago on how to extract data from a zip file. So I want to give full credit to him, because the code I'm about to show you, I have blatantly copied from his blog. So with his implicit permission down below, it's here to be used. But essentially, what I've done, let me come down here. I'm going to put this off to the side so we can refer back to it. Is I've copied some non-trivial M code. I've made some changes to it to work with this specific data source and to transform it in the way that I need. I did most of this work in Power BI Desktop. It's a productive tool. It's happy. So what I can do is I can come back. Stop. What have I done? There we go. Apparently I'm fat fingering things today, but I can come back in and I can add a new entity to my data flow. I can choose a blank query. I can simply paste in that M code, and even though there are transformations that are included in this code that are not exposed through the browser Power Query UI, or honestly for this one that are even exposed through the desktop UI, I can go from this URL that returns a zip file. I can decompress it. I can look at the data that's inside it, which is going to be the 3 different files, 3 different CSV files, and I can go all the way down, doing the transformations. All I will do is give it a name, and we will do one more of these. Come back over here while that's going. So that's sort of the short one. The actual getting the data back out itself has some pivoting and unpivoting, so that's a longer script. But the reason that I want to show this is to show that even though here in preview, some of the UX capabilities in the browser are lagging behind what you would see in Power BI Desktop, the shipping GA desktop application. The parity from an M execution perspective is very high, and one of the things that I've seen a lot of our private preview customers doing is working with queries that they have already created and are using to load into Power BI data sets, like into those tabular models inside the Power BI service. And they are instead loading these into the Power BI data flow entities, so that instead of being part of that analytics model, part of the final stage in that data pipeline, they're taking the existing logic, because it's just Power Query, they're taking that existing logic and moving it further upstream to create these reusable entities that can then be used as data sources for consumption from data sets, reports, and dashboards by users in any workspace inside the tenant, and because of that integration in with Azure, can also be used as a data source for data scientists or data engineers who are not working directly in Power BI. So I've gone through 4 entity creation steps so far. We've got our CDM account. We've got 3 custom entities, one of which is very simple, 2 of which are more complicated. I'm now going to save this. I will give it a name and a description, and I'll be prompted either to refresh now or to set up a scheduled refresh. For this one, I'm going to say refresh now, and I will close it out. And I will show as well that while this is running, we're not going to wait for it. What I do have is a existing data flow that I've set up previously, And if I look at its settings, I can see that I've got a daily refresh scheduled. The same refresh capabilities that are used for data sets in the Power BI service are used for data flows as well. And incremental refresh, which has just come for data sets, will be coming to data flows shortly. So as a general rule, if you think about data sets as being the, just upstream in the data production pipeline or the data manufacturing chain, but still being part of Power BI and behaving like other things in Power BI, your expectations will largely be met. One thing that I should stress as well is that the data used for Power BI data flow entities comes from the same quota, the storage quota that you get with your existing Power BI licenses. So if you're using Pro licenses, I believe that it's 10 gigabytes per user that's available. If you're using Power BI Premium, each premium node comes with 100 terabytes of storage capacity, and those are those limits, or those quota limits still remain. Both data set and data flow data counts against those same limits. So we've gone through, we've cleaned and ingested some things. Now let's actually work with it. I skipped one slide ahead. So this is really going to be the biggest anticlimactic demo of the day, which in my personal opinion is the best thing ever. It's always great to say, oh, here's this new cool thing, think of all the things that I can do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But most users, especially most business users, they don't feel that way. They think, oh, why is this new? Why did this change? I knew how to use it before. So when we're working with data flows, any user in Power BI desktop, they go into the same get data experience. They have a new data source that shows up right with the rest of the data sources. When I connect, since I've already logged in using my organizational credentials, my Azure Active Directory account, it's not going to prompt me to log in again. And if I come in here and look at this, here is the so notice there's nothing showing up. There's no entities yet. It's still refreshing on the back end, so that's not a huge surprise. But if I expand out this World Bank climate change data flow that has the same two entities that I'd pasted in, I can have the same preview experience that I'm used to seeing. When I choose these two, I can choose to load them or to edit them if I want to do additional changes. When I choose load, it will go through that same process that every user is expecting to see. At this point, what I'm doing is building my tabular model inside of Power BI Desktop, which I can then publish with both the data set, the reports, and we can use that for building dashboards up into the service. But the difference is the data for these tables is managed by and under the control of the Power BI service. So from a user perspective, the user, the analyst that is going through and working with this data may not ever know, may not ever need to know, but from an end-to-end management perspective, the fact that we've got the data that is being used as the refresh source for our Power BI data sets also stored and managed by the Power BI service is going to give us significant advantages. So let's move on. So I want to be very mindful of the time. So as you can probably tell when we have a slide, this is, oh, these are the problems that that exist today, and we're talking about a new capability. Of course, we're going to then come back and say, oh, and this is how we solve these problems. The thing that's real behind the slide is that the challenges that we see Power BI customers facing around the world. All right, so that's done. Let me come back to the slide. We see Power BI customers facing around the world. A lot of the gap a lot of the reason why those problems continue to challenge customers is because of a lack of self-service data preparation, enabling more users with more backgrounds to produce these reusable data sets. And because of this lack of structural or semantic consistency between the different applications, which makes it harder to tie everything together. So with the data flows in Power BI, we're making significant strides to reduce the impact of this challenge. So we still have the same reports and dashboards and data sets. So you'll notice that in Power BI Desktop, I loaded the data from the data flows, but I didn't actually go through and create a report. I didn't publish it. None of this has changed. I'm the worst data visualization guy ever. My reports make users' eyes bleed. So I respect each of you far too much to try to build a report for you on the fly, but also it's not new. The new part, the magic part, is that upstream part, not the reports and the dashboards, not the tabular models and data sets. It's the fact that we have the data flows that can then load data into that Power BI area inside Azure Data Lake Store. Now, let's move on quickly. We'll skip over some of the transition slides. So everything that I've talked about so far and everything that I've demonstrated so far is stuff Power BI customers get. So it's an experience where the Power BI components and service will read from and write to Azure Data Lake Store. But as a customer, as a Power BI customer, you don't need an Azure subscription. You don't pay anything extra for it. You don't have to use any other tools. But there are scenarios where organizations who have dedicated data scientists or data engineers or simply complex integration patterns where they want to work with the data created by a data flow and to use that as a source for other work, we have additional scenarios for this as well. So you'll notice this is a screenshot rather than a demo, just for the purposes of time. We're not actually going to go through this part of things hands-on, but in the Power BI admin portal, we have the ability for customers, for administrators to say, rather than using the data flow storage that comes with Power BI, with my Pro or Premium licenses, I want to use my existing Azure Data Lake Store resource that is part of my Azure subscription and to have this be the storage for Power BI. So once you do this, you're prompted to provide the account credentials, and from this point on, all of the data, those CSV files and the JSON metadata, all of this information will be stored in the account, to be more specific, the Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account that you specify. So what this allows is the data production, so the preparation itself and the logic to do the ETL to load the data into the data lake. This can be done by any Power BI user with permission. So you don't need a data engineer, you don't need an ETL specialist to create this, but because the data is going to get put into data lake storage, it can then be used by any service or client that knows how to read CSV and JSON files from Azure Data Lake Store, which for all intents and purposes is anything. It's just a text file, and the structure inside Azure Data Lake Store is something that we're calling a CDM folder. So again, coming back to that common data model. So the standard approach is going to be that you will have a folder for each data flow, a file, a single CSV file for each entity, and then that JSON file that describes the contents of the folder. But there are other scenarios such as incremental refresh and partitioning, where you will have a set of CSV files for a given entity, and it can it can get more complex. There's lots of flexibility that's involved here, but in this bring your own account or bring your own storage account scenario, Power BI is still writing to these folders in Data Lake Storage N2, and other applications can then read from them. The final scenario here, so the final flow is basically flipping that around. So if we're using the data created by the data flow in other services, that's one way. But what if we want to have data that was produced somewhere else to be consumed inside of Power BI? And one of the examples, so this slide is focusing on a specific use case, where this use case is focused on the Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations service. So Dynamics 365 F&O has a capability, which again is coming in preview very soon, where it can dump its data, or it can export its data into a CDM folder in your organization's Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account. So you basically say, export the data into Data Lake here and keep it current, and then those CDM folders can be mounted as what we're calling external data flows or external data flow entities into your Power BI tenant, essentially showing up as a read-only entity inside of Power BI, so that any user that wants to use that Dynamics 365 data as a data source for doing their own self-service BI or additional transformations using more data flows, they can simply use that external data flow as a source, and again, as is often the case here, the fact that it's managed in Azure, the fact that it is being written to by another service, they don't need to know, because it again just shows up as another data source. And the interesting scenario here from an application development perspective, so we have a group that is focused on ISV scenarios, so independent software vendor scenarios explicitly, where there are patterns of applications being developed, where any application that produces data, it can produce data and write it to the ISV's Azure Data Lake Storage account. So basically, as a software vendor or as a data vendor, you can have your data stored into the Azure account that you manage, and you can then, through a Power BI application delivered through the App Source Store, allow your customers, so think about the blue outline being part of your organization or your Azure subscription. You can allow your customers, where the orange outline is part of their subscription or their tenant, to have your data mounted and available inside their Power BI instance. And this gives you control over the data, but makes it seamlessly available to them, sort of bridging some of those organizational gaps. So that solves that problem. And this, honestly, I'm watching the clock. I think this is where I want to stop with the slides, and where I want to do a quick verbal summary of what I will not demonstrate today. So, for a variety of reasons, which I'm going to blame on the public preview and our fire drill in the building this morning, I don't have this demo ready, but one of the capabilities that's coming in our public preview is the ability to have entities that reference each other that will automatically update. And let me do this. So I don't know exactly what I'm going to draw, so we're going to discover this together. But if we picture an ETL flow, let's say that we've got two data sources, and we have data flow entities inside, where this data flow, its query might pull in data from here, this might pull in data from here, and this might pull in data from these other two entities. So the traditional ETL flow. So if you've ever built a complex data warehousing or data transformation system, orchestrating between the dozens or hundreds of packages and executables can often be very complicated. And making sure that, for example, I don't execute this query until these two queries have already successfully completed. The fact that each one of these entities is self-describing in its lineage. So this is kind of a key thing here. It's not that there's an external process that is pushing data or inserting data into the entity. The entity loads itself. It knows what its query is. It has the logic and goes and pulls the data in. Because it's all managed by the Power BI service, if this entity loads successfully and this entity loads successfully, this one will automatically update. And in this simple example, it's kind of trivial. There's 3 of them. It's not a big wow. But if you think about the last data warehouse projects that you worked on or were involved in, you probably had hundreds or literally thousands of these packages. Each one of them is kind of trivial in scope. Orchestrating hundreds or thousands of them, people spend huge amounts of time and money managing that. With data flows and the ability to have them linked and automatically update, similar to how cells in an Excel workbook will automatically update. If a value in one cell changes, you never worry about the other cells that reference it changing as well. You take that for granted because it just works. In this regard, Power BI is really bringing the Excel-like capabilities of programming. So Excel is to programming as data flows is to ETL is one of the ways that we think about this. So trying to bring as much of the capabilities for data preparation to as many users as possible, and to make it an integrated part of the Power BI platform. We are out of time. I do want to stress that the public preview announcement will be coming very soon, so keep your ears peeled for that. And if you are going to be at the Microsoft Ignite conference next month in Orlando, I would love to see you there. I will probably be the one guy from Microsoft with purple hair. Can't guarantee that anymore, kids these days being what they are, but definitely come say hi. And if you're going to be in the Seattle area for the PASS Summit in November, please come up and say hi as well. And with that, I will turn this over to the organizers to wrap things up. And I want to say thank you to everyone for sticking with me.
Thank you, Matthew, for this great presentation. I did have a trouble here with my laptop. I got a blue screen of death and came back just before you wrapped up. So I'm not sure if you have seen the questions we have on the board.
So I don't see any questions. So I don't know how I don't know how it works.
If you still have a few minutes, let's go over a few of them.
Well, I'm looking in chat and I don't see anything. Are you going to read them?
Yeah, I'm gonna read them for you.
Cool.
So Sarah is asking, can you use Power BI report as data source and import the report data? I'm gonna read it again. Can you use Power BI report as data source and import the report data?
So I'm gonna. This is a simple one. I don't know. The answer that I want to give is no. A report is not a data source. The data set underneath the report very likely can be used as a data source, but it will be used, it depends on your specific scenario. But I do want to stress that even though I work on the Power BI team and have been doing a lot of work with data flows, I do not claim to be an expert on all parts of Power BI. So this is something that I don't know the answer, so I don't want to say no, even though I believe the answer is no.
Gotcha. Carlos is asking, what kind of permissions are needed to access data to access the entities?
So the permissions for public preview are going to be set at the workspace level. So you will need to be a member of the workspace in order to read from an entity, and you'll need to be the owner of a workspace to write to the entity. And one thing to stress, and I think I managed this in passing, but I should stress it again, data from an entity in one workspace can be used by authorized users in data sets in any workspace, so they do cross workspace boundaries. And I stress that the workspace level permissions is the public preview plan. The data flows team is working on having per data flow permissions, so that inside a single workspace you could have multiple data flows with different permissions set for different users and groups.
Oh, that's very different from what we have for reports today and apps. That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, if you think about this as well, though, the role of a data flow, the whole reason that we're doing this is to enable more capabilities for self-service data reuse or managed self-service data reuse. So it is different, but it's also something where the scenarios that we're trying to achieve are different than what we would look at for a report or a dashboard, for example.
Nice. Good to know. Thank you. Got a couple more. Cormac Referee asks, if the data gets stored in the Azure Data Lake, is it all visible then to other Power BI users? Is there built-in partitioning or security?
So I'm gonna answer the question in a couple different ways. If you have if you're using the default flow where Power BI is managing the storage, so this is what I demonstrated today. All of the security is managed by Power BI at the workspace or a data flow level. So only authorized users can see it. Cormac did not use the term row level security, but I'm going to answer that question anyway because it was kind of implied in there. The answer in that context is that data flows do not have row level or column level security. It's the security is set at the the higher level at the workspace or data flow level. So the authorized users that can see a data flow and its entities will be able to read all of the data from that entity. This is very common for data lakes and data warehouses, but it is not appropriate for all scenarios. So it's definitely good to be aware of.
Perfect. Thank you. Greg Kramer, awesome job, Matthew.
Thank you, Greg.
Despite the fire drill.
The neat thing about the fire drill, I'm not sure if you follow the news, but Seattle, it smells like it's on fire with all of the wildfires on the West Coast. Seattle has had these increasingly urgent air quality alerts and warnings over the past week. So it was just a fire drill, but we had to evacuate the building, and we got outside, and it's like, oh, I smell smoke, because the entire state smells like it's on fire. Yes.
Cool. All right, two more. Carlos again, Carlos Sacristian. So data flows and their entities are some kind of little master data service?
So short answer is no. The longer answer is the fact that we have the common data model, so those common schemas for defining the common business entities, this often makes people think of master data management or master data services. But when you think about what a master data management platform or tool needs to do, it's about the curation of the data. It's about having a single, highly trusted golden version of the truth, where typically there are data stewards or other people whose job it is not to make sure that the data is available, but to make sure that it's always correct, that every customer has the right address and the right stakeholders and things along those lines, that although there are, there are longer term scenarios where these services and capabilities may get closer. If you're thinking about MDM in the BI space, think about your master data management system, whether it's SQL Server, MDS, or something else. Think about that as being one of the sources from which you would pull data. So what was it, 6 years ago at TechEd, I did a session or co-presented a session where we showed master data services, data quality services, and data integration services working together. And the pattern that we presented then was basically treat your master data services entities as a source for your dimensional data in your data warehouse. But because it's master, because it's the one version of the truth, you want to use it in as many places as possible, and the analytics or BI data warehousing path is just one path where that data is used. The data flow entities in Power BI, even though they are flexible and can be used in multiple ways through this Azure integration, they are not intended to be a master data management capability.
Perfect, great, comprehensive as usual. Thank you so much. One last one from Daniel Spezin. About performance, that Power BI desktop doesn't deliver good performance for larger files. How does that behavior in CDS?
So that's sort of a bigger question where I'm going to put on my consultant hat and say it depends. One way, and it's true. It's whenever you get into performance, it's very situational. There are lots of variables and lots of ways that you can approach it. I guess the dark side of my, this works just like you would expect it to work with any data source in Power BI desktop. Well, it's just another data source in Power BI desktop. So the performance that you would get today in Power BI desktop working with a big source in Azure Data Lake, through data flows or otherwise, is going to be similar to what you would get in another big data store with similar volumes and performance characteristics. So this is a specific end-to-end flow or a specific functional area where we are actively investigating ways, how do we make it better, not just for data flows, but for big data in general. I don't have anything or any specifics that I can share publicly, but be aware that this is something that we hear from time to time, and it's something that we're aware of and are looking at.
Nice. Is there any file size limitation, like for CSV files, Excel files, file size limitation? Daniel still asks.
I don't know. I am pretty sure that I read, and I read so much and I retain so little. Please don't quote me on this. He says, even though he knows the meeting is being recorded. But I would swear that I read something recently that Azure Data Lake Store Gen 2, supports like exabytes per file or some ridiculous scale. It feels like voodoo to me. But if there are size limits, those limits are those of the Azure Data Lake Store platform, and those limits are designed to be beyond what customers need for big data scenarios. So that's something. If you're going to ask me a question on Twitter, that's one that I'm curious about. And if you tweet it at me, I will reach out and get you an authoritative answer at some point this week. I'll need to track the right people down, but that's a good question.
So there we go, Twitter for that one. I do have a couple of questions of my own, but on that thing of file size, I learned on the recent project, I had a 34 gigabyte file to load into Power BI, and it kept blowing up memory because it has to compress and do the transformations and compress, I think, all the time. But when I broke the file down in like 13 files of smaller sizes, memory never suffered. So perhaps it's better to work with multiple smaller files than a larger one for
Yeah.
our query to process better.
Yeah, and that's another it depends type scenario as well. So even though that it's great to have those patterns to follow, just be aware that because it's not just a text file, that's the storage, but it is being managed by multiple services, that you may not have the same performance characteristics here.
Yeah, cool. So from a developer's perspective, you have shown us a lot of no-code demos. Are all of these functionalities available through APIs for developers? Like I'm trying to integrate my SQL, Azure SQL DB with these things. Can I do these things by code instead of by drag and dropping?
So short answer is yes. The medium answer is there are lots of things that I showed, and I am not 100% certain that every single thing that I showed today is exposed currently via an API. I believe that they are, but if you run into a specific step that isn't currently programmatically accessible, that one's on me. But the main thing that we're looking at doing from a coding perspective, in addition to having organizations being able to, to automate their deployment and things like that, is to enable this as an application development platform through the AppSource store. So the ability to create data flows programmatically to do all of that setup is definitely a core scenario.
Perfect. Cool. I think that's all. There are no more questions there on the questions panel. So Matthew, once again, thank you so much for sharing all of this that's coming up to us in a couple of weeks, hopefully. If I can, I just would like to share a few slides here to wrap this up that I was supposed to do at the beginning.
Awesome. But, I will stop sharing my screen.
Perfect. Thank you. And let me go ahead and share my one here. If I can make myself a presenter first, I would like to thank all of you guys who are still hanging around after the presentation. It's yeah, keep connected, and this is a community group. It's a virtual community group, so you're welcome to present too if you would like. So, and if you have some content you would like to share with the group, with the virtual community, get in contact with us, with me, Armando, and Carnegie. We'll definitely take a look and schedule your session. And I'm still looking here for my own presence on the panels. There was here a option to well, I think I'm not going to be able to present my slides today, but in any case, we want to give a shout out to Soaring Eagle. Soaring Eagle is a leading provider of software development, database architecture, and database performance, and it's our sponsor, it's our gold sponsor for our group. So always go ahead and Google them out and check out their websites. They have great presentations on how to improve performance on SQL queries. And please don't forget to do the evaluation. You're gonna get an email from GoToWebinar to follow with an evaluation form. For those of you who come to fill up the evaluation form, we have some Amazon gift cards to raffle among those who, again, for those who fill up the evaluation form. All right. So don't forget to click on that link and let us know how we did this time along. With that, I think that's all. Thank you so much, and I see you in the next session. Thank you again, Matthew. Have a great day, my friend.
Thank you.